Hey everybody, thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be going through the discography of Meshuggah, the legendary metal band to come out of Sweden, and my number one all-time favorite metal group who are long overdue for a tier list video. I've been a huge fan of them for about 10 years now, and in my opinion, no one comes close to them when it comes to intricate grooves with all sorts of brain-twisting polyrhythms that make your head spin. The guitar parts and drum grooves are so complex, but also very tasteful and groovy at the same time, which creates this perfect blend. And the fact that most of what they write is in 4/4 time makes it even more impressive. And whenever I listen to them, there are countless riffs that continue to stump me, and it makes for a very fun little challenge of trying to feel and count their riffs when you're listening to them. And they've been a group that has just been an endless amount of material for my very curious mind. And the fact that they are all in their 50s now and are still just as badass as ever makes them even more amazing, and I think they have definitely left their mark as one of the most unique and important voices to come out of metal music, and I'm very happy to finally be covering them for today's episode. And what I'm going to do is go through their 9 studio albums. I won't be including any EPs. I know a lot of people also include none in their rankings, but I'm just going to be sticking to the studio albums, so I will be going from Contradictions Collapse up to Immutable, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 9 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1991 titled Contradictions Collapse, and I will give this a C. This was a tough album to score because although it is on the lower side of this tier list, I will say there is a lot of things that I do really enjoy about it, but in comparison to a lot of the rest of their discography, I wouldn't say that this is one of those records that really stands out to me or one that I find myself going back to very often. Stylistically, this is in a much different realm from where they would end up on their future albums. This is much more within that thrash and alternative metal sort of space, with some progressive elements as well, but a lot of the types of sounds and guitar grooves and vocal stylings of Jens are not as present on this record, and at this point they were still trying to find their voice as a group and determine what sort of stylistic direction they wanted to go in. But regardless of that, I still think there's some really great stuff on this record, and as far as thrash metal goes, I think musically this material is much more interesting than what you would get from a typical thrash metal group. It's 9 tracks long, and I do think the majority of these songs are solid, but at the same time, none of them would be regarded as any of my favorite Meshuggah tracks. And like I said, this stylistic side of Meshuggah is not a sound that I gravitate to as much as where they would go on their future releases, but it's still a solid album with some good tracks. My personal favorites would be the opener, Paralyzing Ignorance, as well as Internal Evidence, Qualms of Reality, and Choirs of Devastation, which goes into a lot of interesting territories. I also love Frederick's guitar solos throughout this record, and I love the fact that we get so many of them. There's a solo on almost every track, and that is one of my personal favorite elements of some of the earlier Meshuggah records. And my favorite solos on here would be Internal Evidence, Paralyzing Ignorance, Abnegating Cessity, and Greed. So this record does have a lot of great qualities to it, but it's just not one of those albums that I find myself going back to very often, and it doesn't contain any of my favorite Meshuggah tracks, and I just think they have other albums that would follow it that are much stronger and deliver that classic Meshuggah sound, which isn't as present on this record. So a decent album, but not one of their best, so I will give this a C. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 1995 titled Destroy, Erase, Improve, and I will give this an A. Some people are probably going to be surprised that I'm not putting this in S tier, and this does seem to be one of those records that does have a lot of diversity of thought within the Meshuggah community, and I love this album, but after reviewing the full discography, I do think they have some other records that follow it that are even better, so it didn't feel right putting it in S tier, but this is certainly a great record that put them on the map and is considered a classic album to come out of 90s metal, and definitely a significant improvement from Contradictions Collapse. I think everything on here sounds enhanced. Stylistically, they're really stretching things out more, giving us this amazing fusion of thrash metal, groove metal, progressive metal, and a little bit of fusion elements, and it makes for a very adventurous and unpredictable track listing that goes in all sorts of interesting directions, but maintains a very cohesive and grounded grounded sound all throughout it. I think the songwriting is much more interesting on here. For me, it has way more exceptional tracks than the previous record did. And again, we get a ton of guitar solos, and Frederick Thorndahl's guitar playing is an essential component of the Meshuggah sound. And as a guitarist myself, that is definitely one of my favorite elements of this record, because we have tons of amazing solos from him on almost every song, similar to the first record. And to me, that aspect of it adds a whole additional layer of depth to this record. And these tracks do a great job of showcasing the two different sides to Frederick's soloing, with the more technical outside sounding intervallic lines on solos like Beneath, Soulburn, Transfixion, Vanished, Inside What's Within Behind, and Terminal Illusions. But we also get a couple of tracks that showcase some of his slower, more melodic sensibilities on tracks like Future Breed Machine, Acrid Placidity, and Sublevels. And of course, this album is filled with tasty guitar grooves that alter between some more straightforward, hard-hitting 4/4 grooves, but also plenty of those classic Meshuggah polyrhythms, which are also in 4/4 most of the time, but a lot of the times it's hard to figure out exactly where the beats line up. Some of my personal favorite guitar and drum grooves are on the tracks Soulburn, Future Breed Machine, and Inside What's Within Behind. As far as favorite songs go on here, I would have to go with Future Breed Machine, which is a Meshuggah classic and one of the great opening tracks of their discography. And my other favorites would be Transfixion, Beneath, and Soulburn. So an amazing album that marked a turning point for Meshuggah and their trajectory as a band and what sort of sound they would continue to build off of. But like I said before, I do think they have other albums that would follow it that are even better, so it didn't feel right putting it in S tier, but it was a very close call and right on the cusp, so this one will get an A. Alright, moving on, we have their third studio album from 1998 titled Chaosphere, and I will give this an S. I think this is an amazing record, and it would go down as my third favorite Meshuggah album. I love everything that they did on here, a further evolution of their sound, delivering us some very hard-hitting, aggressive, just brutal-sounding music that makes you feel like you're getting punched in the face right from the opening track. Everything sounds massive on here, and I think this was the first album where Meshuggah truly veered away from where their sound started and found their voice and really started to utilize all of the techniques that we would regard as that classic Meshuggah sound. A lot of these songs are much more fast-paced, and there's still some thrash elements present, but we're also hearing much more of those polyrhythmic elements, which is obviously a staple of the Meshuggah sound. And it's 8 tracks long, and it features my personal favorite opening track of any Meshuggah album, Concatenation. That song is just so unbelievably badass, and the guitar parts are so rhythmically intricate and aggressive, just attacking the listener with these menacing sounding rhythms that are so disorienting and so hard hitting. The perfect energy to kickstart this record. And then that is followed by New Millennium Cyanide Christ, which is a Meshuggah classic and another favorite of mine on here. And I would regard these two tracks as two of the strongest opening tracks of any Meshuggah record, with the exception of one other album that we will get to that I think the opening 2 tracks are even better, but I hold these 2 songs in just such high regard. My other favorites on here would be Corridor of Chameleons, Sane, and The Exquisite Machinery of Torture, which has some really cool vocal work from Jens, alternating between the demonic sounds of the first section into the screams on the second section. So I think everything on here is further enhanced from Destroy, Erase, Improve. It's definitely their heaviest music to date, with some incredibly tasteful and intricate guitar and drum grooves, and an incredibly cohesive and consistent 8-song track listing, with the opening 2 tracks both making my top 10 favorite Meshuggah song list. So an awesome record, my third favorite Meshuggah album. This one gets an S. Alright, next we have their fourth studio album from 2002 titled Nothing, and this one gets an easy S. This is a fantastic album and a classic from the Meshuggah discography. For me personally, it would go down as my second favorite Meshuggah record. I think this is a very dynamic album that offers a lot of variety from track to track, but never loses the core elements of the Meshuggah sound, and I think this record marked another turning point for where they would go on future albums. Stylistically, this one one ventures even deeper into the groove metal, progressive metal, and avant-garde sounds, with less of the thrash elements that we had heard on the previous records, and it's also the first album where they switched the guitars from 7 strings to 8 strings. The original release was done on 7 strings, which were being tuned down, but they ended up re-recording it with 8 strings, and I think this transition was another positive change in the evolution of the Meshuggah sound, and offered some additional low notes to take us into even heavier and deeper territories with the guitar riffs. It delivers an amazing selection of 10 songs that all work off of one another beautifully, and features multiple songs that I would regard as some of my favorite Meshuggah tracks. I think the opening 2 tracks in particular might be the strongest opening succession of 2 tracks of any Meshuggah album, with Stenga and Rational Gaze. Both are absolutely legendary tracks that kickstart the album in the most hard-hitting and tasteful way possible. Some other standout tracks for me would be Organic Shadows, Spasm, Straws Pulled at Random, and the closer Obsidian, which is this beautiful instrumental guitar track with pretty clean parts that provide a very ambient backdrop that eventually turns into distortion, and a great example of the further evolution and stretching out of their sound, and a very tasteful way to close this incredibly consistent record. I love every single track on here, and I think this was an important record for Meshuggah and the continued expansion of their sound, and also a key contribution to the genres of progressive and groove metal. So an incredible album, my second favorite Meshuggah record. This one gets an easy S. Moving on, we have their 5th studio album from 2005 titled Catch 33, and I will give this an A. I think this is a very good album, and I will say, of their entire discography, this was the one record that took a little bit of warming up for me. I remember liking it when I first heard it, but I wasn't crazy about it. But the more I listened to it, the better it got, and my appreciation for this record has grown more and more over the years. This is their most experimental album to date, with the entire record being a single 47-minute suite that is split up into 13 movements, and this was also their first record to feature programmed drums, which I was not aware of when I initially heard this, and they did a great job of making the drums sound very realistic. And these 13 movements in the suite are mostly on the shorter side, ranging from 1.5 minutes to 3 minutes in length, and of the shorter tracks, my favorites would have to be Persona non grate. I'm always unsure if it's grade or grata because of that extra E at the end, so let me know in the comments if you know how to pronounce that one. And I also love Autonomy Lost, In Death is Life, and Entrapment. But to me, the real peak of this album is the 13.5-minute In Death is Death. That is such an incredible song, loaded with tasty guitar and drum grooves, and it takes a spooky detour halfway through into these ominous ambient guitar soundscapes that feel so disorienting, and I absolutely love the effect that it creates. This would definitely be a top 10 favorite Meshuggah song for me, and I know this is a pretty divisive album within the Meshuggah community. I have heard some people say this is their best album, which I don't agree with that, but I also don't agree with the people that say that this is one of their weaker records. I think they achieved what they were going for on this in a very effective manner. They delivered a very long 47-minute suite that's divided up into 13 movements, and I think it has a very cohesive feel to it. And while there are some moments that do start to feel a little bit similar, I still think they mix it up just enough to make things stay interesting and not get too monotonous. So I would say it's not their best album, but it's certainly not one of their worst either, and I think changing it up at this point in their discography was a very effective choice, and I think this record holds a unique place within their catalog. So a very solid album. This one gets an A. Okay, next we have their 6th studio album from 2008 titled Obzen, and this one gets an easy S. Absolutely incredible album, and this one goes down as my favorite Meshuggah record. I think this is pretty much a perfect record from front to back. It has such an incredible track listing with an amazing selection of aggressive, hard-hitting songs that produced some of the best tracks of Meshuggah's entire discography. It's also probably my favorite record of theirs from a production standpoint. I love the way the guitars sound on this. Everything just has such a massive and full sound, and further enhances and accentuates the brutality of this record. It's 9 tracks long and features a nice selection of classic Meshuggah tracks paired with equally as strong B-sides. The obvious really popular song to come from this record is Bleed, which was really one of the songs that exposed them to more of a mainstream audience, and being a track that was featured on the video game Rock Band definitely helped helped further that reach, and obviously it goes without saying that that is one of the craziest double bass patterns of any Meshuggah track. I can't even imagine what Thomas's legs feel like after playing that song. It's such an intense leg workout, and for me personally, my favorite tracks on this album would be Electric Red, which I think is one of the most underrated Meshuggah songs. I particularly love the guitar riffs that come in at the 1 minute and 45-second mark. Just such hard-hitting and badass guitar and drum grooves that completely encapsulate the brutality that this album gives off. Other favorites would be Dancers to a Discordant System, Combustion, and Pineal Gland Optics. But like I said, I do not think there is a weak song anywhere in this track listing, and I would regard this as their most consistent album with some of the strongest individual tracks and the best production of their discography. And I think if somebody wanted to explore Meshuggah's music, this would probably be the album that I would recommend them listening to first, because I think it contains all of those classic Meshuggah sounds that you want from a great Meshuggah record, and it's just an incredible album. So this is my number one favorite Meshuggah album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their 7th studio album from 2012 titled Koloss, and I'm going to give this a B. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with this scoring, and this seems to be one of the other albums that a lot of Meshuggah fans are all over the place on in terms of their rankings, and I do think this is a good record, but for me this has always been one of those Meshuggah albums where I think it's decent, but at the same time there isn't a lot about it that really stands out to me in comparison to some of their other records, and I've been listening to this album for almost 10 years now, and there still hasn't been that light bulb moment where something finally clicked and I understood why some people hold it in such high regard. And ultimately for me, I think it just comes down to song preferences and which Meshuggah tracks resonate with me the most. And there are certainly a couple of tracks on here that I think are incredible, but as an overall album, I wouldn't say that it's as strong and as consistent as the 5 albums that preceded it. It's 10 tracks long, and for songs that I really like on here, I would go with the opener, I Am Koloss, which I think is a fantastic start to the record, a super cool song with a nice build in dynamics and some really brutal guitar riffs. I also love Behind the Sun. That would be my favorite track from this record, and probably my favorite song that was written by Jens Kidman of the entire Meshuggah discography. And I think the last chunk of the album does pick up some steam with Swarm and Demiurge. Demiurge is obviously the classic song to come from this record and a high point of the second half of the album. So as you can see, there are definitely some high points throughout this track listing, but for me personally, I don't find all of the songs on this record to be of the same quality as those awesome tracks that I listed and resonate with more on the previous records, and I don't think any of these songs would make my top 10 favorite Meshuggah song list. So certainly not a bad record, but in the grand scheme of the Meshuggah discography, this one does fall a little bit lower on my ranking, so I will give this one a B. Alright, next we have their 8th studio album from 2016 titled The Violent Sleep of Reason, and unfortunately I'm going to give this one a C. Not a great album in my opinion. This would be my second least favorite Meshuggah record right after Contradictions Collapse. It does have some qualities that I enjoy, but as an overall album, I do find a lot of this record to be pretty underwhelming, and I remember when this was coming out, I had really high hopes for it, and ultimately I was a little bit disappointed. Typically the group would record their parts separately, but on this record they actually recorded it as a live band, which I think is cool, and it's a pretty long album with 10 tracks running almost 59 minutes in length, and I will say there are a couple of tracks on here that I absolutely love, but there is a good chunk of songs that I also find to be pretty uninteresting, and I don't think a lot of these songs really offer the listener any new sounds to sink their teeth into, and a lot of it to me just sounds like rehashed Meshuggah material. Like I said though, there are a couple of tracks that I do think are great. In particular, I really enjoy the opening 3 tracks. Clockworks is the perfect opener that just kickstarts the album with that classic hard-hitting and aggressive Meshuggah vibe with really cool polyrhythmic riffs, and I think Born in Dissonance is an amazing follow-up track, and I also really enjoy Monstrosity as well. And I remember when I was listening to this album, I had very high hopes after hearing these opening 3 tracks, but ultimately I do think the momentum does die down a lot after that. But the only other song on here that I would say I really love in the remainder of the track listing would be Stifled. I will say though, that is definitely the high point of this record for me, and a song that would easily make my top 10 favorite Meshuggah song list. And not only is that a great song, but it also has my number one favorite Frederick Thorndahl guitar solo. There are so many interesting sounds going on throughout it, and the backing groove underneath it is incredibly badass. And I actually did a video years ago covering that guitar solo, so if you're interested in checking that out, be sure to check out the Meshuggah playlist, which I will link in the comments and the description. But I do think Stifled does save the later half of this album to some degree, but unfortunately I do think the remainder of the songs on here are just not that strong, and are probably some of my least favorite songs in the grand scheme of the Meshuggah discography. So unfortunately not a favorite record of mine. I will give this a C. Okay, and lastly, we have their 9th and most recent studio album from 2022 titled Immutable, and I will give this an A. I think this is a very good album and a significant improvement from The Violent Sleep of Reason. I think this album was well worth the wait and clearly shows that Meshuggah is still fully capable of writing some incredible songs. It's their longest album to date at almost 67 minutes in length with a 13-song track listing, and I think they do a great job of giving us the full palette of different Meshuggah sounds that can be reminiscent of multiple previous albums while still keeping things fresh. And I think because of that, this track listing does feel pretty consistent and doesn't get too laggy in any parts, for me at least. I think they probably could have shortened it the tiniest bit by maybe 2 tracks or so, but ultimately I don't think the longer length takes away from this record very much. Musically, I think they're delivering some awesome stuff on every front. We have those classic heavy and polyrhythmic guitar riffs, some really amazing drum parts from Thomas. Jens's vocals are still amazing and powerful, especially for someone in their mid-50s, and Frederick delivers some amazing solos which always enhance any Meshuggah record that they are on. My number one favorite track on here, hands down, would be The Abysmal Eye. I remember when they put this song out, it made me so hyped for this album, and this is a track that would make my top 10 favorite Meshuggah song list, and I absolutely love that whole middle section where Thomas is just going nuts over those dark held out guitar notes, and then following that section up with an amazing Frederick solo is just the icing on the cake. Such an incredible song that delivers everything that I want to hear from a great Meshuggah track. Other favorites of mine on here would be Phantoms, Armies of the Preposterous, The Faultless, Light the Shortening Fuse, and I Am That Thirst. Just so many rock solid tracks, and it's amazing that they can still write such great music this far into their career and still maintain all of their elements of brutality, and I just could not be happier with how this record came out, especially for the year 2022. It's not quite up there with the records that I put in S tier. I do think those are still a bit stronger, but this is still an album that I hold in a very favorable light in the Meshuggah discography, and I'm very happy with the way it came out. So an awesome album. This one gets an A. Alright, so those are my takes on their 9 studio albums. Like I said at the beginning, I was long overdue to make a Meshuggah tier list video. Since I started my channel years ago, I've done numerous different videos covering different Meshuggah solos, as well as some rhythm transcriptions, and a lesson video for a lick in the Stifled solo. So Meshuggah has been a part of this channel since the beginning, and they hold a special place in my heart, being my favorite metal band, and it was a real treat to be able to go back and revisit these albums and solidify my thoughts on each of them, and it's never a bad time to revisit some Meshuggah, so I was pumped to do it. But if you're interested in checking out any of my Meshuggah videos, I'll have the Meshuggah playlist linked in the comments and the description, and also if you're interested in checking out any of my other tier lists, I will also have a playlist for that linked in the comments and the description as well, so be sure to check those out and see if there's anything else that you might like. And please let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 9 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that is it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.